Okay, guys, let's have a round of applause for our guests. And honestly, looking at you, I just feel like a young one that needs to be taught about what made the British Games great. Because you were there, I wasn't even planned back there. But let's start off with a simple question. Which one of you started all of this?
Who's the oldest?
Me.
I think. One of these three. One of these three. We're babies. We're babies. Yeah.
I mean, I've been doing it for 6 years. Right, what do you want to know? I mean, I came into the industry by accident. It had started, but the scene in Liverpool was interesting, to say the least. Gary outlined the number of teams that did exist in and around Liverpool, but the one that I started my career with, even though I only did one game, was Imagine Software, who are kind of infamous rather than famous. They spent more money on pizzas, Formula One racing cars, not paying the bills, not paying the staff, and basically writing a horrendously long list of increasingly shit games. So I wouldn't say that the Liverpool scene was responsible for the start of the industry, but it was certainly the cradle of one part of it, and a lot of the people who emerged slightly scarred and burned around the edges from the fallout of Imagine went on to bigger and infinitely better things. I'd like to think that I'm one of them. Gary, fortunately, did not get tarred with any of those brushes from Imagine. But no, Liverpool was very, very, very formative in the start of the English game dev scene. Gave us people like Gary, like Jim, and a host of others who, sadly, some of them cannot be here because they've shuffled off. But no, I wouldn't say I'm formative, but no, Liverpool. Yeah, okay.
So why did they all point to you?
Pardon?
So why did they all point to you?
What did they all?
Why did they all point to you?
Well, why did they point at me? Because I'm big mouth. I'm a Scouser. We've always got an opinion about everything and anything. Even we'll argue our right to be wrong. But no, I don't know if I'm the oldest on the line, but I'm one of the oldest. A lot of people say I should not still be in the industry, but I am, and I'll never quit. Okay, next question.
Yeah. But isn't any one of you going to own it and say, we kicked it off?
It was everyone.
It's not owned, it's a shared thing, like we all did our own piece in our own time. You know, everyone in this stage now and hundreds of other guys. It was a movement that happened across the country. Different people doing different roles, some people developing, some people publishing, some people like David working on distributing the machines we could work on. It was just a movement that happened collectively. It wasn't a conscious thing, you know.
I can actually give an answer here. It wasn't for me personally, but the company I worked for, Millennium Interactive, it came from a company called Logotron. Logotron originally made education software to teach people how to sort of do basic movements. For a little turtle on the screen, type in FD50, it would move it, RT90, around, and from that, they realised, actually, we can turn this into a game. From that's where Millennium Software, which I first worked for, developed. So it was basically as a result of education software in schools.
Most of you, as far as I reckon, didn't start in gaming. You were brought in. Is there can you identify a single thing that brought you to games as a medium that you wanted to be active in?
Sorry, it's got to be me again, but the reason it was us, I mean, it could have been anyone, because like I said earlier today, the industry didn't exist until people like us stepped up, and I mean, you had businessmen who they got a sniff of money. Oh, these new things called home computers. You know, we've tried selling cars, we've tried selling clothes. Let's try these computer games. So there were kids at home writing games in their bedrooms, and they were mostly coders that came in first. People like myself, artists, came in later, but not considerably later. But we just came along. But if it hadn't been us, it would have been somebody else. It would have been another coder, another pixel artist. We were just in the right place at the right time. And that place was all over the UK.
But it didn't.
Were we in the place at the right time? I don't think so. I think the thing is we had a love for doing something once we actually started. And, you know, and I think that's what it was about. You know, we started this industry so many years ago, I can't remember. But it was really important that I think all of us loved what we did. And I was doing, well, not a job, but a hobby. And I'm getting paid for it, which was really nice.
Nothing to add there. Okay. Sorry. It's a bit hot here. I wanted to ask how... You said that you were just there, but it didn't happen all over Europe. It happened mainly in the UK. Europeans were following suit.
We're a nation of early adopters. That's what we do. We see some hardware coming in the door and we'll want to go at it. I remember I was working for somebody when teletext came out. Do you remember teletext? Silly little messages on the television screen. And I was with my boss and he was gazing in the window of a television shop at a television which had teletext on it. And I was saying, this is rubbish. This is really poor. There's nothing very much going on here. But he wanted to buy a television with teletext. And that's fairly typical of the UK population. When video recorders came in, VCRs, do you remember how every household in the country wanted a video recorder overnight? And the market went from nobody having them to 2 years later, 95% saturation. We are just a nation of early adopters. And what you see here, Ian's got a point to make, but what you see here were people who were prepared to ride that wave.
I think for me the important thing is that the UK is a creative nation. Look at our film, our fashion, our music, our publishing. We've always been very creative by nature, and if you put technology into the hands of a creative nation, hey presto, that's a video game. And the fact that coding was adopted early on in schools in the 80s enabled that creativity to be turned into digital content. Therefore, you know, the BBC Micro was the cornerstone of computing in schools, and everybody had a Sinclair Spectrum, a very affordable, programmable machine. So that native creativity, access to affordable computing, gave rise to very early success in video games. And so all these guys were doing all that because they're either creative or they're good technologies. But you needed both for video games.
I think I should say at the time, when some of these were making the games, I was the target audience. So I didn't get into games until 1990, actual development. So I was playing them during the 80s. And in certainly the very early 80s, we only had 3 channels on television. So it was either you stuck with what your mum and dad wanted to watch on television, you try and find somebody to play board games with, or you go out and you play football or something. And if there's nobody to play, you've got nothing to do. So when computers came along, that was something new, and everybody wanted one. We wanted this new thing. Obviously, you had to take over the television, and your mum and dad would complain, but nevertheless, that was a good argument, because apparently you could use these computers for school, which obviously wasn't the case. We would just play games on them. And at the same time that happened, that's when we got computers in schools, and it was really getting pushed as this is a new thing. All the kids need to be taught about it. And for me, that was really where I started programming. I had a Commodore 64 at home, but I didn't really do much with it. But we had lessons at school that forced us to make shapes and get things moving around and so on. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of people had started that way. That was where they got their first touch of a computer and realized this is something totally new. This is something that I can see on television, that I have made move. You don't need a load of equipment to make movies. You don't need to make anything complicated. You type in a few commands and something moves. And it was like magic at the time. And I think there was a really big movement in the UK that lots of kids were in the same position as me, and we wanted to see where this went. We wanted to do more with it. And at the same time, early on, the games are relatively simplistic. And even me, 10 years old, looking at the games at the time, it seemed to me that if I just stuck at this, I could make them as well. And I think that was another important thing at the start of the games industry. Games were simple enough that it looked like if you put the effort in, you might be able to contribute some games as well. Yeah, a can-do attitude to everything. And that's...
So basically what you're saying is that making awesome games came down to boredom, patriotism, and early access to computers.
Not boredom. Yeah, basically, like, I think, but for me anyway, personally, it was Clive Sinclair bringing out the Spectrum and the ZX81, making computers affordable for everyone in the UK. And that helped, because then there was a lot more people with computers. And so with living in the UK, the weather was terrible, it would rain, so you'd have to stay indoors. And what better to do than play games or learn how to make games yourself? And that for me was the start of it.
I think that's the key thing, is the Sinclair Spectrum, with deference to Commodore, which came a little bit later in the UK. But it was a uniquely, you were asking what started the whole thing, the revolution in the UK, and I would attribute that to the Sinclair Spectrum. It was a very British machine, everyone embraced it. The BBC Micro was there as well, but it was quite expensive. The Sinclair Spectrum was relatively affordable to everyone and anyone, and that's what began the revolution. And the early games of the Sinclair Spectrum, by the likes of Imagine and Bug Bite and obviously Manic Miner from Software Projects, Bug Bite as it was, they came out and they inspired so many people, myself included to a certain extent, to get into that industry. Everyone saw what the potential was and thought, I've got this relatively cheap machine and I can build a whole new platform. And I think that's what inspired and started the revolution in the UK. And then when the Commodore VIC-20 and C64 came along, that just enforced it all and widened it.
I just think it was in the UK a collision of several things. So if you trace back to the 1950s, 1960s, you had people into home radio, making their own radios, home electronics, and then computers came from that. And then we also had a lot of people in their own bands making music from a successful British music scene, being creative. And then, I mean, I came from a band, so the computer came like as another medium to express your creativity, you know. But we were used to, in the UK, being creative and having some commercial success from it. We had enough examples in the technology and in the creative side. And then the publishing field at that time was very open. They were all non-controlled platforms. So setting up a publisher and getting going was quite easy. If you had the money to buy the units and get going and go through distribution channels, it wasn't like the console era where everything was controlled and gated through the console manufacturers. So the collision of the opportunity to go to market and the two electronics and creative hobbies colliding is really, I think, what got a lot of people kicked off. We were kind of ready for it, if you like, you know?
Okay, so since Sinclair started it, I can't believe every single one of you thinks that it's the best platform to work for. What was your preferred platform for the 20 years that made the British games great?
Whichever one paid the biggest sort of salary. I mean, again, on my talk earlier, people were saying, did you have any control? As a freelancer, you just went with whoever was going to employ you. And so if people called me in and said, Simon, we want you to do 2 versions of a game. We want you to do the Amstrad and the Spectrum. That's what you did. You had preferences, but you had preferences for various reasons. You'd say, well, I know that if I draw something on the Spectrum, because the pixels are square, it's pretty much going to look like what I want it to look like. Whereas if you did it on the Commodore 64, you got those fucking horrible sort of house brick size pixels that you really struggle to make it anything look recognizable. But it's still a hell of a machine. And then you had the Amstrad, which had 2 modes, with all the beautiful colors, and then the 4-color high-res mode. So for me, there was no preferred machine. It was just, my preferred state was just being employed.
As a composer, the Commodore 64, hands down.
Yeah, no question. There is no comparison, and there still wasn't in any other device for the next 10 years. The Commodore 64 sound chip just destroyed everything. And for me, and I know for Barn as well, we got started in music basically because of the Commodore 64 musicians. So that was a big deal for us, and that was a real target for me. I mean, these people were our rock stars, and again, that's come out of the home computer scene because they had this machine that they could program themselves, and I'm sure they were seeing what was going on and seeing all of their peers getting into computers and thinking, well, yeah, I can do some of that as well, and that's what they did, and they were our inspiration to get into games and hopefully carry the torch there for the British game industry.
Specky forever for me.
Well, talking about the 64, I think when it was released, it kind of gave a real boost to those people that had been making games before, because suddenly they've got a whole other medium in the music side of things to enable them to produce games that were not only visually engaging, but also vocally amazing. And I think that really boosted people wanting to write games. There's no question about that. And then again, obviously speaking from my own experience, but when the Amiga was launched, that changed everything completely again. It was a much easier product to work on, and a much product that you got almost instant response from when you started working on it. The sad thing is, of course, that initially Commodore used to make and sell games, bloody awful, most of them, I have to say, except something like International Soccer. That was a massive hit. But we saw the error of our ways and got out of software. Why compete with the people that you need to work with? It didn't make any sense. And then you've also got to remember that there was a massive time with 64 and Amiga and other products where the amount of copying was just incredible, and it made it very difficult for people to spend a lot of money making a game that they knew was going to be copied in the playgrounds the next day. So that was, and I think we took a responsible view of that. We were the first hardware company ever to join FAST, the Federation Against Software Theft, just to show that we actually wanted to cooperate and collaborate with these guys. And there's one other thing I think is extremely important, and that, remember, this was a cottage industry, and everybody knew everybody. It was so good that you could rub shoulders with your competitors. You could, be competitors in the day and then have a beer with them at night. And that's not like that anymore. Now it's all suits and numbers. People aren't people anymore. They're just a number on the payroll, which is a sad thing. But they were very, very exciting times, and I concur with the guys who said couldn't wait to get to work. It was just a fantastic time.
Does looking at people here, people from the industry here, bring you back somehow? I mean, Polish industry is way younger than the British one, and it seems to be at the same point that you were talking about in the case of the British industry.
It's interesting to see the number of indie games that are being displayed here. I'm quite surprised by how many and how good they are, because I've been to quite a few shows over the past couple of years. And although there has been indie development stuff, it's been a lot more international. And some of the games here have been blown away a lot of the stuff I've seen at the other shows. So it does look like what's happening now in Poland it's a very nice, I don't know, somebody's investing somewhere in the right areas, and there's a lot of good stuff going to come out of it. So hopefully that creativity, will just go on to greater and greater strengths. It's good to see.
Just from a developer's point of view, it is different now. I mean, in the old days, we would make a game, do a demo for 2 months, and go and sell it to somebody, and get money 2 months in to making the project. The big difference now is the opportunity to commercially be safe and run a company and buy a house and look after a family from the money you're making from games. Just from a very human perspective, that's still quite hard for indies, or a lot of indies that I talk to at the moment, and that's what we could do with the shift. You know, being clever at selecting the good indies earlier and supporting them financially from a stronger point of view early into their project to support them, you know.
But was that model from the 80s really sustainable?
Yeah, absolutely it was. It was, yes. When we had less, we had, naturally the good guys came to the top quite quickly in the 80s, and there was enough good product, I think, in general to choose from. So now you've got a lot of people, but it's too many people. It's like 1,000 people wanting to join a football team at once, you know, there's not enough spaces. So I think that model needs to be ironed out for the developers, and it will be great. And then, it's great that the machines are giving the opportunity, but the model's not quite right from publishing right now at the moment, because the publishers have got a slightly harder job than they used to have, mostly.
I think it's very important to remember that we were making money. Serious money, it's certainly in the early days. And that's a big difference now. What we were able to do was to release a title in the UK on its own and make enough money from that to justify the investment in the title. The world has completely changed. Now, if you want to release a title and you want to make money from it, you've got to release it simultaneously in something like 150 territories in the world. That takes a lot of marketing budget, way beyond the likes of people like us, except possibly, well, I won't name the really rich people amongst us, but it's so much more difficult. So for the indie developers in Poland or anywhere else today, in order to find the funds to do the marketing, which is absolutely crucial to get the mind share amongst the people who are going to pay for the product in the end, you've got to have something which really is very distinct and very different and very separate from the competition. I think that's a difficult ask.
I would say this is the second golden age of games, and there's never been a better time, I think, for the independents to monetize their own content. I mean, you're saying it's all about the suits these days. I disagree. The independents are being really successful because they don't need publishers, particularly. The traditional gatekeepers of distribution are no longer required. In the old days, you had to build physical media, i.e. cassettes or jewel cases and CDs or DVDs, go through distribution channels into retail, pay for all the inventory, manage the returns. That required a lot of capital. Therefore, the publisher had control because they had the money to do that. Therefore, the developer would not benefit as much as they do today. Now, that distribution is not required because it can go straight to a global market via the internet. So you can monetize your content globally. So marketing can be done in multiple ways. Obviously, you can get influencers on board if your game is good, and you can learn to monetize once you've, the release of the game is the first part of it in this process. The game after 12 months is totally different because it's going to evolve over the time. If you understand data, metrics and analytics, and understand how to acquire a user, how to retain that user, how to monetize that user, and if the lifetime value of that user is more than the original cost of development, the ongoing cost of development, and the user acquisition costs, happy days. So there's new skills required for an independent to be successful: data science, analytics, and a new kind of marketing. It's just that indies can evolve now to do all that themselves. They don't need the publishers.
They don't need the publishers, but they do need an understanding of what you've just explained about how you might roll out a product and monetize it. It isn't just about creating a game which you think might be good fun to play. It's about how are we going to roll that out into the market in such a way that we're going to make money from it.
Can I just raise a point going back to the 80s at the start of the industry? I wonder how much the UK had been very successful in music right throughout the 70s and into the 80s. I wonder how, if anybody here knows, how cheap was it to do cassette duplication in the UK compared to other countries because of that? Because there must have been quite an infrastructure there just from doing music duplication that was all ready and available to be used for the games that were getting made by the independents.
Yeah, I mean, cassette duplication, I think, if memory recalls, we were paying about 15p per cassette from Ablex at the time. So the cost of the media was relatively cheap. But you still had the issue of distribution, and therefore you had to go through a distributor and then through a retailer, and everyone would take their cut. Whereas these days, you put your game out digitally, and obviously you have a greater margin commercially for yourselves. So it has changed dramatically. In the old days, to talk about the old days, we'd develop a game, it would take 6 to 12 months, the game would go out, we'd start on the next game. Today, you finish the game, you release it, but that's pretty much the start. It's a living game. And the development team continues to iterate, improve, and add to the game to keep the interest and retention going. So it's a very, very different market today than it was back then. And I just want to add, on a personal note, this is the first time I've been on a panel which is larger than the audience. So.
Yeah, just getting back to the challenges that the software developers and publishers had in terms of marketing. We absolutely set the standard in 1989, working in close collaboration with Ocean, when we did the Batman pack, because all of our marketing was aimed at the game, not the fact that there was actually an Amiga inside was almost irrelevant. And that changed the whole industry, because not long after that, Sega and Nintendo all copied suit. But of course, Sega and Nintendo, they were making a lot of money out of games, out of royalties and stuff. So in our case, we weren't. We had to make the money out of the hardware. But we always believed that working collaboratively with the software publishers was the way forward. And there's no question about that. It really changed the whole face of marketing.
One of the things that I loved about the 80s and 90s is the consumer, the player, wasn't counted as a cash cow, and they weren't made to pay just to get to the next stage, whereas that's the way it is now, because you have all the analytics and basically marketing people. And whereas back in the 80s and 90s, a game was a game. You got the whole game, you didn't have to pay more, you just got the game and you could play the whole lot of it, and it was great, and it was good. And we had 3 months, not 6 to 12.
You keep going back to money, and nowadays studios talk about development in terms of war chests and being able to afford to fail and then restart and redo a game. And you keep saying that development back then was really cheap. Was there any talk of how many games you can fail before you can achieve success again, or was it we need to succeed at every single time? And was it the thing that drove the industry?
I can tell you, Sensible Software, 2 out of 3 of our games were hits for the first 10, right? Because we had backing from people like Gary to let them come out and actually happen, and other publishers. But importantly, the game I'm working on now and the previous one have taken 4 years each. In that time, we've had almost 0 income for the 4 years. How can you survive with a team of 8 guys for 4 years with no income? It's that. Ian's correct. Once you get to the stage where you are selling it, there's advantages, but it's getting to that point of having the great game to sell, which is the hard bit, getting there. I was speaking to an independent Polish developer out there today. He said the same thing. It's been 4 years, you know. That's the bit that we have to survive as developers. And in the old days, we could go to any of these guys down here, Gary or Andrew or whatever, and get a deal and get some money up front and survive the time. That's the difference. Because the game development time used to be 6 months, 1 year. Now it's 3 or 4 years. That's the big difference.
It was 3 for us anyway.
3 months.
Yeah.
I also think there was an interesting time as a child in the 80s buying games. There were 2 types of games. There were the cheap games. There were your Mastertronic. Mastertronic was a fantastic brand for us in the 80s because the games were £1.99 or a petrol one was £2.99. Well, the expensive games, which you had your birthday or Christmas presents for, were £9.99. So you could afford to possibly buy one of these £1.99 games every couple of months. And on a special occasion, you would save up for £9.99 games. But it simply meant that you had so much more games throwing out. So for me, I don't know if the guys Mastertronic gone here, but I loved the business model of doing that. And I'm pretty sure that quite a lot of those games were published by them. They were simply guys in a bedroom send off their demos to Mastertronic and say, we'd like to release this as a game. And a few months later, they go, great, we've done it. So for me, that was a fantastic business model.
Okay. Guys, you mentioned being very patriotic, being early adapters. How did you feel when industrious guys like Guillemots came over and say, we want to sell your games back in France? Did you look down on them and say, okay, these guys know nothing about the industry, we can sell them anything? Or were they just complete outsiders that tried to do something that they didn't know anything about? Because that's the optics of how the story of Guillemots, of how they began in France, was told a number of times. And I was just curious how the British industry reacted to those guys that just want to sell British games in France.
I think that's quite an interesting question, but I think you've also got to realise as a developer and actually selling the games, when somebody comes from the international market and says they want to publish your game in those countries, you're going to go say yes, because it makes your market bigger and it makes your income more. So yeah, but I didn't think about it at the time when to answer the question.
I think at Ocean, what we did strategically was we made sure we had relationships with all of the key territories. So we had specific distributors in Spain, in France. In Spain, for instance, was a company called Hare, and we actually published their games in the UK as well. And Australia was Aussiesoft. So we made sure we had relationships with all the key, Germany as well, all the key areas. So we had distribution there. And we didn't really have a problem, if this is your question, I couldn't quite hear it, but we didn't have a problem with our games in those territories.
Actually, we did have problems. We had a lot of success across Europe, and we didn't care who we sold to. Whoever offered us the most money, we would sell to, because that's our job, But to sell in America was very hard in the 80s and 90s. We never had a hit. Did you have a hit? No.
Nintendo changed that.
Yeah. So that period, it was hard for us to break the States. Has anyone else had big hits in the 80s and 90s?
But of course, the big thing about America is if it's not made in America, they won't buy it anyway.
That's because it needed the big box. That's because it needed the big box.
Yeah. I mean, in America, the big change for us was the Amiga, and obviously the Amiga was very, very big in the States, and that got us our games out there. And of course, a lot of the games that we were publishing were high-profile licensed games, movie titles, coin-op titles, so there was recognition. So the adoption in those areas and those territories was a lot easier, if you like. And then when Nintendo came with the cartridges, obviously we had a more global distribution, and that opened up Japan as well, and Asia generally, for companies like ourselves. So all of a sudden, you had UK companies, little UK companies, who were able to have a global reach. It was expensive, cartridges were incredibly expensive, but it did allow us distribution in a much, much wider territory, which was much more challenging before that happened.
In terms of distribution, were problems breaking into the US markets one of the factors that sort of cushioned you against the problems that the US market and the Japanese market had during the crash of the 80s of the video game market?
Well, I was just a programmer, so I didn't have any choice on the market. No, Ocean did all the marketing and everything, so it was all left to them. I was, as soon as I'd finished the game, they got on with the marketing and I got on with the next game.
I think I'd like to ask the other publishers along here, but the difficulties for ourselves with the American market was nothing to do with getting over there. We didn't have the platforms to get over there. The C64 was the only common platform we had with them. The problem was them coming the other way. And it was much easier for an American company to, with such a big market, such a big home market, to see the UK as a stepping stone into the European market. Would that be fair? And so there were a lot of games came across with the C64 in particular from the US, taking what I regard as our market. I mean, really, they shouldn't be allowed to do such things.
Was there any?
Well, you had companies like US Gold who were bringing big American titles over, but the fact was you also had Sierra and EA and companies like that who actually weren't making a big impact in the UK or Europe. They weren't publishing directly in those territories themselves, and I think in some ways perhaps it was UK companies that managed to export to the US with success before the US got a major foothold. And the big difference, which has always been of great upset to me, was that I do attribute the success of the US to the investment out there, that the basic business people, the investors, would put money behind games companies because they saw what the future would be. Whereas in the UK, traditionally the investors were very, very conservative, and it was difficult to get backing for any UK company. It may have changed a little bit since then, but it was difficult for any UK company to get substantial backing to be able to forge ahead in other territories at the scale that was needed, which required quite a lot of investment.
What was the source of this distrust or disbelief?
I think technology generally, as I say, attitudes have changed a little bit, but back then VCs were very, very traditional, oil, gas, medical. It was the general blue chip areas that they would invest in. Games were still a fledgling business. It was a fad, and so it was too speculative, as is any hits-driven business. Same with music, the same with movies, and that's why, again, in the UK, the movie industry started out very, very strong, but the Americans really dominated, and still do, that particular industry because the investment is out there. I think the British investors are a little bit more conservative in that regard, and understandably, but it's very frustrating.
I can give one quick direct example from our catalogue. When we released Cannon Fodder was a big hit across Europe, yeah, from Virgin Europe. But there was some battle between Virgin Europe and Virgin US going on. And I remember we flew out to Virgin in the States to show them Cannon Fodder, to show them this new game. And all they did was they took us around to show us Westwood Studios and how great it was. And we were about to do Command & Conquer. And Cannon Fodder, which should have been successful in the States, didn't happen at all there. So they had, they do like to support their own stuff more. That was the tradition at that time, rather than we were kind of open to it, things coming from everywhere. But the US was mainly American stuff and Japanese stuff, obviously. But there were very few, maybe some of the Bullfrog stuff worked over in the States. I can't think of many companies where it worked early on in the States for them.
I think it's also a lot of reflection back on the game writing initially around the time of the 64 and Sinclair and all those things, because that in itself was revolutionary, and I think a lot of the game playing was very compelling because you didn't have, videos and video images and animation and stuff like that. So they made the games, I think, much more compelling. And I mean, I'm not a game player. I never play games, but the interesting thing is that when you're talking about this nostalgia thing, which is what we're all here for today, they relatively recently released the 64 Mini, and I don't know if you know, but they've sold over 250,000 of them already. The 64 Mini, which really is an indication of how compelling the games were. And if you were, you're an adolescent in that period, and now you could afford a bit more money, they're still buying the retro stuff. It's quite interesting, isn't it?
I think I'll just state about the further development of the industry with regards to the British game industry. It always keeps coming back to money, but when all of this American investment started and the Americans were forcing themselves across the globe really by their financial clout, one of the things that did happen in the early 90s was a huge brain drain from the UK to the US, and a lot of the developers at the time went where the money was, and that was the US, because the UK did start to struggle because of that, and the publishers didn't really have the financial clout to keep going in the same way the Americans did. I mean, I was at Psygnosis, and we got by because we were bought by Sony, so we had huge financial backing for that, so we were okay. But in general, the US was where the money was. Now, I later I was working for an audio middleware company, and I went for a meeting at, this is probably around 2001, I went for a meeting at Rockstar San Diego, and it was with 15 of the lead programmers, and 14 of them were British. And that's how the developers spread across the world, and certainly at the start of the PlayStation era, even though it was American money, there was a huge contingent of British developers that were pushing through that and making that happen. So thanks to the computers and the creativity that was going on back then, the people of my age were doing stupid little programs and running music programs on these things. In the UK and Europe in general, it was a lot more creative because of that, because if you're in the US or you're in Japan and you're playing console games, you couldn't do anything. There was no creative outlet for that. So the only way you could write a game is if you got a job at a game company, because they could afford the very expensive development kits for the consoles. Whereas over here, because everybody had home computers, it really did forge that creativity, and then developers went on and then spread themselves around the world to bring games to everybody else that way.
Was there a point in the 80s that any of you thought it's going to end badly now within the next 6 months, and it's going to be bad?
Yeah, I mean, you went into work. I've gone down on record many a time as saying that people say, when did you realize that you were part of something really amazing? And I said earlier today, it was just a job. I mean, we loved what we did, but it was just a job. If Gary had come in one day and said, sorry guys, it's all over, we would have been very sad, but we would have moved on. Nowadays, we would be absolutely devastated. I mean, Ocean Software, people remember Ocean very, very fondly. And at events like this, I'm asked by guys like you, or I'm asked online, wouldn't it be great if Ocean came back? No, it fucking wouldn't. Because Ocean was a creature of the time. It was supposed to exist when it did. It was supposed to die when it did. If Ocean came back, it wouldn't be the same. I was talking about this today. Wouldn't it be great if the Beatles came back? Well, no, there's only 2 of them. I'm going to see Queen tonight. No, you're not. Freddie died fucking years ago. You're not going to see Queen at all. So it wouldn't be Ocean. So every day it could have ended, but it wouldn't have been any big deal.
I must say your pragmatism is really impressive. I mean, everyone talks about games now as a form of art and realizing themselves via games, and you're just saying it's just work. Was that a general attitude during the 80s?
I think, I mean, I've met certain people who say, oh no, I've poured myself into this game, and I feel like saying, well, get your fucking head out your ass and let's talk sense. yes, it is an art form, but trying to get a message across, and it's the entertainment business. You know, we make toys. I mean, okay, we could get a serious message across, but we're not trying to change the world. And anyone who says they is just full of shit.
I think you might have a counter to that. It might be a counter to this one.
It's not quite a counter-argument, but I have seen a tendency in the game industry in general for artists to not be as bothered about the games as the programmers, for example. Because a programmer is making their game, whereas an artist is providing art for their game. And the artists that we had, I mean, originally at Psygnosis, they all came from fine art courses, so they had no interest really in games. It was an interesting new thing for them to do. But for them to have left games wouldn't have been that big a deal, because they were interested in the art, not necessarily art for games. It's different now because people want to do games. But even back then, if you were a programmer to do games, I mean, you could have gone and done business software and you would have earned more money. But it really was for the love of doing games that people did it back then. Because as a salaried developer, I mean, the money was pretty poor, to be perfectly honest, and the hours were ungodly. Yeah, but we did it because we loved it. We really did. But as I say, as a slight counter to that, I think that artists generally have a slightly different opinion on that than other developers.
I have to agree with Mike there. When we were making games back in the day, I was doing it because I loved making games. I loved playing games. So I wanted to make games that I would be happy playing with. So I did put a bit of effort into it. And making a game that was playable was, for me, was what it was all about. But it wasn't about the money, because, as they've said, the money wasn't that good for us workhorses. But yeah, it was.
I don't know. People might have got the wrong end of the stick there. For me, gameplay is everything, right? That's it.
Totally.
I mean, the clue's in the name, game, right? If you can't play the game, and I like I said earlier, I've done graphics from absolute turkeys. But that was down to poor design and shoddy coding. And some of the coders I worked for in the past just didn't give a damn. You know, Roy Gibson. Oh, let's just give that game to Ocean. Highlander. They'll never notice how shit it is. Boy, how wrong he was. So, no, I am passionate. I mean, I've struggled desperately being a pixel monkey, but I'm still here and I'm not going anywhere. So to say that artists in general don't care as much as coders, we really do. I mean, we really, really do. It pisses me off when if the only gig in town is working on a shit game, then I have to take it. But I do my absolute utmost graphically. And you do try and you say, well, couldn't you change this bit of gameplay? No. I mean, I do hope, before I finally shuffle off, to get a couple of quality games of my own under my belt. I'm sick and tired of working for other people who don't give a shit.
I'm really intrigued by this. I'm really intrigued by this. There's never been any doubt in my mind that computer gaming is an art form. Never at all. I mean, and whether you're a programmer or an artist or a soundman or whatever, it's neither here nor there. And I believe from the very early days that it was the modern art form. And I called my second company 21st Century Entertainment, because for my money, it's going to be the art form of the 21st century. And I think this is being borne out. I mean, the film industry is gradually getting taken over.
It is an art form, but anyone who gets precious about it, anyone who gets precious and arty-farty, then I'm just not fucking interested, right? You know, they go, oh, it's an art. Yeah, there's a difference between saying it's an art form and going, it's an art form.
Absolutely, exactly so. It's an art form that belongs to us. It doesn't belong in some gallery. It doesn't belong with some art critic. It belongs to the people who make the stuff in the first place. And to be honest, it belongs to you guys who play the games. You know it's an art form. You know it is. You know the experience you get from it. You know what it does to you. This is obviously an art form, but it's a far superior art form to mere painting, isn't it? And it incorporates It incorporates that, and it also, I said earlier on this afternoon, the sound effects in a game are where the emotion of the game lies. What goes in your ear is what really moves you about a game. I come back to the same thing. This is the art form of the 21st century, and we're all part of that.
Okay, I just want to say that the art is in combining artists, designers, programmers, the commercial side, and making it fit, you know? I think what I'm hearing actually is a difference between us running our own companies, taking all this risk, getting our way but having no financial safety belt, as opposed to someone stuck in the team feeling held back by it. From our point of view, from me and Mike running our teams, we've had to run with our feelings and command these teams and give freedom to artists and then reel them back, and the same with technical guys. And the art is in combining, getting the skills of all the individuals to work together and having a director head on all the time. So I think that is the art from a game making side, you know, combining the arts.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. I think that's a nice point to wrap up. And I would like to ask you guys to thank those noblemen for their time.
Can I do a mic one?